mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Mike Brasher. I'm going to be your host on this episode. And today's discussion is going to be partly in response to a listener comment that we received earlier this year. A guy by the name of, or his handle is Redboat Mark, asked us if we could do an episode on a portion of the Pacific Flyway Goose forecast. And there's a little bit of nuance to his request. We couldn't actually do exactly what he wanted to. We're going to follow up on that a little bit more. But we kind of morphed this a little bit to do a Pacific Flyway overall goose forecast. And whenever we began to sort of explore that idea, I knew exactly who I wanted to join us for that. We've had him on the podcast before. He's within Ducks Unlimited. He has a lot of knowledge about goose in the Pacific Flyway, and that is Kelly Warren, Ducks Unlimited regional biologist for Western Oregon. Kelly, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Mike.
So, Kelly, I referenced you as sort of being the person that I wanted to go to, and I do consider you one of, if not the, sort of expert of Pacific Flyway geese within Ducks Unlimited. There may be other people out there that would take issue with that, but from my perspective, kind of given the way you've helped us in the past, I wanted to bring you back on and talk about this topic of a Pacific Flyway goose forecast to the best we can. And before we get into that, I wanted to give you an opportunity to reintroduce yourself to the listeners and tell us of all the different ways in which you've
thanks, Mike.
come to be fascinated with
Kelly
geese
Warren,
and knowledgeable of geese there in the
Dallas,
Pacific Flyway.
Oregon. Growing up, my passion was going after geese in the Willamette Valley, and we lived in an area that has very strict regulations on goose hunting. We have dusky Canada geese here, which are a low population and are protected by bag limits. We used to have check stations where you had to take in all your geese, but where the crux comes is you have to identify duskies from 6 other subspecies of Canada geese that winter in the area. So hunters are required to take a test and pass that test. And for years, we had to do check stations, and you basically get what is called your permit zone validation. So you basically a permit to hunt in certain areas of Oregon and Southwest Washington. So that spurred passion very early for the amount of differences in sizes and colors of geese that we have in our area. And then what originally started me just in the wildlife field in general was my grandfather and my dad, who took me out to the duck blind at a very young age and taught me not only the importance about hunting, but the importance about conservation. So that is kind of where it all began. And then in 2006, I partnered with ODF&W and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and put together the study guide for taking that test to hunt geese in Oregon and Washington. And to this day, I work off and on with ODF&W and WFW to improve that guide for purposes in hunter education.
And did you work for the state at any point in your career? Have you been with DU ever since you got out of school?
So I did work for the state. I work for Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, who did basically focuses on watershed health and habitat through acquisitions, conservation, and restoration projects. They're a kind of a state funding agency for all the people on the ground doing the work. So I worked for them for a couple years and then went to grad school. In grad school, I got my master's of environmental management and worked up in Alaska for several summers, which is some of my connections up there is where I got the information for this podcast today is those connections up there that we're doing all the on the ground surveys this summer, and are the people that help identify how populations are doing. And then I actually work for Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs for several years as an acquisition and restoration person in the Willamette Valley here. And then getting the job for DU. I've been with DU for 4 years now, and it's been a dream to have a job that associates with waterfowl and really focuses on every aspect of habitat, waterfowl, and having an impact on an area that's important to me and I grew up in. So all of it kind of came to a head and being able to work for DU here in Western Oregon.
Well, and it's pretty cool that you're able to maintain those connections to the Goose resource. I know you mentioned the previous work that you did in Alaska that helped you develop some of the relationships. But if I'm not mistaken, I think you seek out opportunities every now and then to go back and help with some volunteer work, or do you just sort of facilitate maybe other people getting to do those type of volunteer work assignments up there?
All of the above. So in Oregon and Washington, we also DU has a Dusky initiative where we and Greg Green, my supervisor, heads that up, and that's forming relationships with Forest Service up in Cordova, Alaska, specifically focusing on Dusky Canada geese and the habitat on the breeding grounds. And we fund an intern position every year for a college student to go up there and do on the ground work with Duskies, and what an awesome experience that is for them. And I believe there is a blog that you can go online and follow that person's work this summer. I believe that internship is over with now, but he did a great job this year. And let me see if I can pull up his name, but and then I was fortunate enough last year to go help Alaska Department of Fish and Game, who heads up the Dusky collaring, and I was able to go band and collar Dusky Canada geese, which was a pretty cool dream for me because I've only worked with them on the wintering grounds doing collar surveys. And so actually to get to squeeze a few of them and put some bands on them was actually a really neat opportunity for me. I've never been able to have that close proximity to Duskies.
There aren't very many of us within Ducks Unlimited that have that regular or even intermittent opportunity to get out and get our hands on birds. There aren't a whole lot of us that do that kind of work anymore. I think most of us in the sort of biology and science discipline within Ducks Unlimited at some point in time had the opportunity to get out and assist with banding, but there's a whole lot of other things on our plates these days that kind of keep us from getting out and doing that kind of stuff, right?
Absolutely, yes. The main priority of my job is delivering habitat projects once those Duskies come down the Flyway so that they have habitat down here, Duskies as well as other waterfowl. If you guys look up Blake Richard, he was our intern this year up in Cordova, and if you look up Dusky blog or Dusky intern, that should come up.
All right, that's good. We'll have to look into that and encourage other folks to do that as well. You learn a little bit about the type of work that goes on up there, and it's exciting to know that there is work occurring in Alaska and some of these other goose colonies. I would imagine that was curtailed back in 2020 a bit, but I think probably started to gear back up last year and probably pretty close to full swing again up there this year, right?
Yeah, it sounds like it was mostly full swing this year, but yeah, there are some data gaps from the last couple years dealing with COVID.
So Kelly, we talked about some of the work that you do with Duskies in the field. We talked about some of the habitat work, but you also mentioned that you got interested in this because of getting out in the field with your father, your grandfather, and hunting the geese out there. How often, I know you still get out and do that, how often do you get out during a normal year? How many days do you spend chasing these birds?
So that's a loaded question, but I would say I am fortunate to live in an area. I live in the middle of my region, and I live close proximity to an area that I grew up in, and where my family actually has purchased some property that has been my basically Ducks Unlimited project since I was really little, and so I have the opportunity to manage that with my dad and other family, and that allows me to definitely hunt more than an average person who might be able to, who is going on public land or asking for permission on private land or those types of things. But as far as geese go, we have a late season that I definitely focus a lot of my goose hunting efforts during that late season, and that's when duck season has subsided. So it starts around the 5th of February and goes to March 10th, and that's mostly to address depredation that geese do here on farm fields in the Willamette Valley. Okay, so what I got out of that was above average. You didn't give me a quantitative answer there, and that's fine, but I got above average out of that. That is above average for sure. All right, fair enough. I'm envious. Wait, where you are there, where you do most of your hunting, which species and kind of which populations of the geese that we're going to be talking about do you primarily have the opportunity to harvest? Sure. So in the area where I'm at, which is the Mid-Willamette Valley, we mostly are focused. The majority of the wintering geese here are cackling geese, actually. So they are scientific name is minima. So they are geese that nest on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and then come down to the Willamette Valley in Southwest Washington. And are they the overwhelming majority of the birds that you would be harvesting, or are there others that kind of get mixed in there as well? I would say 80 to 85% cacklers, 10% duskies to keep you on your toes, and then a mix of taverners in there as well, which are the three primary. That kind of gives us a good segue to sort of set up this episode and begin talking about the different populations, the different species of geese that people in the Pacific Flyway, hunters in the Pacific Flyway, are going to have an opportunity to interact with. And, this is a conversation that I absolutely have to have some assistance with. And to be more honest, I actually just kind of I'll ask the questions and I'll turn it over to you, because I have never professed to be an expert on all the different populations of geese and their migration paths and chronologies and how they may have changed in their distributions. And so that's why you're on here. And although I do know that there are quite a number to distinguish among there in the Pacific Flyway. So why don't we just start there? Kelly, whenever I first asked you to do this, to be the guest on this episode, and I said we wanted a report on Pacific Flyway goose forecast. I mean, that's a pretty big task, and you've created some great notes here. So how many geese or populations of geese are we talking about? We're talking, as far as white-cheeked geese go, we're looking at 7, and some of those are more present than others. You have snow geese, white-fronted geese, and Brant, and then you do have to throw in emperor geese, which winter in Alaska too, because they are also a Pacific Flyway population. But as far as white-cheeked geese go, the different subspecies we're going to be talking about are cacklers, Aleutians, Taverners, and then for Canada geese are lessers, duskies, and westerns. Okay, and the snow geese that we're talking about here, this is probably an opportunity to talk about the different populations of snow geese. Give us the rundown on that. When we think about Pacific Flyway snow geese, where are those primarily coming from? And then kind of contrast that with what folks in the central Mississippi and Atlantic Flyways might be seeing. Sure. So my familiarity with the Pacific Flyway is equal to your unfamiliarity in the Pacific Flyway. So I won't touch on the Mississippi or Central, but most of the snow geese in the Pacific Flyway come from Wrangel Island, Russia, and different kind of scattered parts of northern Alaska and into Canada. And those are broken up under the Pacific Flyway population. So there's two primary populations that come down the Pacific Flyway population and the Wrangel Island population. And that Pacific Flyway population, that's going to be what, Alaska, Western Canadian Arctic. Do I get that right? That is my understanding, yep.
The other thing that I'll probably introduce here, and I suspect we'll touch on it multiple other times, is the role that our state biologists play in the management, and provincial partners in Canada play in the management of these populations, all the data that are collected, and I know you're going to reference that. But, we could have invited any number of people from the Pacific Flyway to join us for this conversation, to lead this conversation. We certainly don't want to sell them short. They are the ones that develop these goose management plans under the auspices of the Flyway councils and their technical committees. So do you interact with that group a fair bit? I mean, maybe formally or informally, Kelly?
I do, so, but it's mostly on the technical side. It's usually the folks that are not necessarily the regulators, but it's the folks who are out there are trying to do the science. And most of that comes from personal relationships I formed in Alaska years ago. But I'm very grateful to have those connections. Just so that I can kind of pique my own curiosity on these geese and how they're doing, as well as for the benefit of the work that we're doing here in Western Oregon on the habitat side.
White-fronted geese is probably where we'll go next. I want you to just kind of talk briefly about them the way we did for snow geese. Where are these birds going to be breeding, and then what's their distribution going to be like there in the Pacific Flyway?
Sure. So, and that's an interesting question because, and we'll touch on that later with the drought down here in the Pacific Flyway. This winter might impact where some of these geese show up. But the two populations of white-fronted geese that come down the Pacific Flyway as well as central Mississippi, the primary Pacific Flyway population comes from the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, which is on the western side of Alaska. And then quite a few of the mid-continent birds come from northern Alaska and the Yukon.
Do those birds, in terms of their winter distribution, do we want to talk about that now? I mean, what parts, do y'all get many of those in Oregon and Washington? Tell me, what's the deal on that?
We do see them from time to time, especially on the way down and the way back up. And I think we're starting to learn quite a bit by using GSM collars. There's been some studies going on in California and I believe Alaska, where we're starting to learn the migration habits and the staging areas that come from that data. And that includes another thing I'll throw in for white fronts. There is a small population of white fronts called tules that are also highly regulated and need special attention. And so a lot of that science has been focused around tules as well as the Yukon Kuskokwim Pacific population of white fronts, as well as snows and Ross. Actually, right now is a great time to talk about white fronts because the last few weeks here, they've definitely been coming down and are heading down towards Sacramento Valley and Central Valley, California.
Now, do they stick around for very long whenever they come through Washington, Oregon?
Kind of hit and miss, and there's no real reason why some do stick around on certain years and some don't. I think it would be interesting to find some answers on that, but it seems with the population being as high as it is, it seems like there is definitely increasing observations of white fronts, but that is all kind of subjective.
Kelly, let's move on here. We'll probably come back to white fronts. Well, I know we'll come back to white fronts whenever we kind of talk about the population status and what hunters may be able to expect. But you've mentioned cackling geese, Canada geese. We're going to come back to those. Emperor geese and black Brant, probably not going to talk a whole lot about those. That's a fairly limited harvest opportunity out there. But for those that are interested, just quick snippets. What can you say about emperors and black Brant?
So emperors, there is a sport harvest in Alaska and population objectives. As far as those two go, one thing I want to say in regards to status report and update, this is not representative of this breeding year. All of the people that are on the ground are gathering data are basically still crunching those numbers. So things that I'm going to be talking about are specifically correlated to the waterfowl population status report, which you can find on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's website. But as far as emperor geese go, they did see a slight uptick as far as the number, and those are basically based off spring coastal zone surveys relating to breeding emperor geese on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta.
So that would have been from earlier this year. Is that right?
That would have been from the previous year.
Okay, that's what I wanted to try to get correct. So then, if that's interesting. Did they conduct surveys earlier this spring?
They did, and I think they're still crunching those numbers.
Okay, all right. So the numbers that you've got there from 2021. So okay.
Yeah, and I will also say there was quite a few people who helped me with putting this together. That, like you said, there is a plethora of expertise and people who are probably more qualified to be on this podcast than I am.
Yeah, well, you were my go-to person for this, and I know you're going to be contributing an article to the Ducks Unlimited magazine here a little bit later on. I don't exactly know the date on that or the month in which that's going to appear, but nevertheless, like I said, you're our expert, our local expert out there within Ducks Unlimited.
Much appreciated. And then as far as Brant go, there's kind of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta population and the Northern Alaska population, and they also saw a slight increase in numbers from the previous year, and that's yet to be determined for what this year's breeding did. But their surveys are winter surveys. They're a cumulative number of wintering surveys from Eisenbeck and Cold Bay all the way down to Baja.
Okay, well, I will be, I'm taking some annual leave here in a few weeks, mid-October, and I'm going to actually be going up to Cold Bay, and we'll be checking out that place firsthand. So I'm not sure if this episode will have aired by then, but it might have a report sometime thereafter, and that's had an invitation to go join some friends and colleagues on that, and so we are going to, I'm looking forward to that. I've never been hunting in Alaska. The only time I've been there is for a conference in Anchorage, and so this is a first for me. It's one of those bucket list trips, and I'm certainly looking forward to it.
I've been very fortunate to also go to Eisenbeck, and you will witness, especially if you're able to get out in boats and the weather isn't too bad, you'll be able to witness some pretty astounding staging birds up on Eisenbeck Lagoon.
I'm ready to go. Can't wait. I guess, whenever we're talking about, as we go through the rest of this update here, we're going to get into the species that I guess are going to be more abundant and that a lot more people are going to see, more important in the harvest. What are, beyond kind of what you've already told us, how do you want to kind of couch this? I mean, in terms of the data, most of this coming from a prior year, but what else do people need to know in terms of what we'll be talking about? Like, how do they interpret what we're going to be saying? It's not like we're not giving a full flight forecast or anything of that nature, but it's how would you have people interpret some of this?
I was going to say, most of we can talk about the specific populations, or we can talk about kind of the specific trends that hunters are gonna see coming down the flyway. And you already touched on one really important one, which is we don't necessarily know what the geese are gonna do with lack of water. But I think in general, we can kind of say some blanket statements like snow goose populations are high and increasing, and snow goose hunting for Pacific Flyway hunters looks bright, especially because there's liberal bag limits and opportunity for snow goose harvest. And a lot of these snow geese are even showing up in other areas where they historically have not wintered before, and forming little other populations up and down the flyway. So you can say something to that degree, but then if you dig into kind of the species that are very focal to and important for Pacific Flyway management, like cacklers or duskies, that's where folks in the permit zone areas, so Southwest Washington and Oregon, are definitely going to be taking some notes, because those are the primary birds that we see.
Kelly, that's some great kind of context for how we might think about these and how people can interpret this as we get into some of the numbers. And I think that's where we want to go next. You've got some great notes here on sort of general population trends and status for these different groups of birds. But first, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll get into the numbers. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We are here on this episode discussing the Pacific Flyway goose populations, a sort of quick update on what hunters may be able to expect this fall. We've got Kelly Warren here with us. And Kelly, we're going to jump right into some of the data that you provided for us. You did a lot of homework here and I appreciate that. And so we're going to start off with cacklers. What can you tell us about population status trends that might be important to hunters that are going to be heading out and chasing some of those?
Sure. So Cackler's management goal is 250,000, and last year's numbers brought it down to around 206. And I believe that definitely called into question bag limits and other things. And Oregon and Washington both concurred that a 3-bird bag limit is needed for trying to reach that goal of 250,000. The number from this year's status report bumped that number up slightly, which definitely helps, but we still are not to that management objective. So it will be up to managers and the Flyway Council to see what happens next. And we also still don't have the breeding survey data from this year, which will definitely play a role in how best to manage cacklers up and down the flyway. And the reason cacklers are important is because they are both a subsistence goose for native populations in Alaska, as well as you have then conflicting issues with farmers down here on the Pacific Flyway depredating crops. So it's all a matter of balance.
And when we're talking about cacklers here, we're talking about cackling geese, right?
Yes, we are. We're talking about minima.
Anything else about cacklers that we want to talk about here before we move on to some of the other populations?
Sure. Well, cacklers are now that they have separated cackling geese and Canada geese, other geese fall within that cackling goose definition, and that includes Taverners and Aleutians as well.
And so let's see, Taverners, let's just go there next. What can you tell us about those?
Sure. So they're hard to study. They just by their behavior, they breed much differently than other geese. They're spread apart. And so getting good numbers on those is much more difficult, and that's both for Taverners and Lessers. We're hoping to learn more about Taverners and Lessers in Alaska and how we can better identify their population. So the numbers that they have are based off of the Arctic coastal plain. Again, an aerial survey that is done, and Taverners look like they had a slight increase, and Lessers looked like they had a slight decrease from 2019. And 2019 is the last time that they were able to get a flight for those birds.
And we're again already kind of mixing apples and oranges here, because we're talking about Taverners as a subspecies of the cackling goose, and then Lessers is a subspecies of the Canada goose, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's okay. I'm just kind of wanting to clarify as we go through this. And so when we talk about Taverners, what's the primary harvest location for those birds?
So there, and honestly, there's not been a lot of research done on Taverners. So a lot of the studies were done in the 80s, and they kind of break them up into subgroups of coastal Taverners versus coastal inland Taverners, and then North Slope. So there's kind of a mixing and matching of where those birds occur all over the state of Alaska, as well as Lessers.
Well, but then what about their wintering distributions and where they would
wintering distribution? Yeah. We're also hoping to learn more about that. And again, not a lot of data on that. They're hard to mark. They're hard to determine. In general, Taverners can be found in Northwest Oregon, Washington, maybe even as high as British Columbia, into the Columbia Basin, and I would say that's a pretty good coverage for the typical areas Taverners are found.
Well, with that kind of covered, I do want to move on to a really bright story. At least it's a bright story from my perspective. Aleutian cackling goose. Talk to us about that. I see here from your note, it's up to an all-time high, around 215,000. Now that's a subspecies for which, like a couple of decades ago, there was significant concern about the persistence of that population or of that subspecies, right?
Yeah, and I'm going to pull up the article that you referenced that I'm writing right now because I kind of have the information on that.
Okay.
But in general, Aleutians were at were a Endangered Species Act bird. And Aleutian geese were put on federal endangered species list in 1967. And at the time, and there was a lot of management factors that were taken into place, mostly, from my understanding, eliminating predators that helped them reach a sustainable level of 60 to 70,000 when they were taken off the list. And now we have a large number of Aleutians within the Pacific Flyway, and is over 200,000 now for this year's population status number.
And that subspecies of goose it primarily goes to California. Is that right? Or do I remember correctly that maybe their wintering distribution is kind of shifting a little bit, maybe north into Oregon, Washington? Tell me about that.
So there was always some that kind of stayed in Oregon, and we definitely Aleutians, I would not say are uncommon in the Willamette Valley, but they definitely are part of probably the 1 or 2% that is found here. They're not in large numbers like they are in Northern California, Humboldt, Central Valley, areas like that. But they can be found in Oregon and what I'm sure are found in Southwest Washington too. And I do know that those birds do migrate up and down the coast as they come down as well, staging in different spots.
Primary harvest locations for those birds is Central Valley?
Yeah. Or I would say coastal California.
Okay, coastal California. What kind of habitats are they using there?
Agricultural fields, dairy fields, probably a mix and match of grain fields as well, silage corn. I have actually not gotten down there and seen those birds, but that, from my understanding, that those are the primary fields that they're using.
Okay, whenever I picture coastal California, I think primarily rocky landscape, steep cliffs, but I know there's the Sacramento River Valley, or the Sacramento Delta. I think I have that right. And then there's probably a few other river deltas. That's probably the source of some of those agricultural fields along coastal California.
Absolutely.
Okay. And that would be around Humboldt, there, the Sac Valley. Where else?
I was going to say probably Central Valley too.
Okay. All right. What else on Aleutians then?
Their trend looks pretty good. It seems that their breeding grounds are fairly stable for increasing populations.
Okay. So if you're in an area where you are have an opportunity to harvest Aleutians, you probably it would be a good year. I mean, or it's sort of average. Is that where you'd start?
Yep. This then gets into talking about kind of hunting strategy as well as bag limit. So, down in California, my understanding is you can shoot quite a few Aleutians in your bag every day. And I've heard from, hunters both in Oregon as well as California that they're getting kind of harder and harder to hunt every year. And so is that attributing to hunting pressure? And, what is the total harvest level? Is it keeping these populations in check or is it not enough to impact the population? Yeah.
Well, we'll just have to kind of keep an eye on that. But yeah, if you're out there in those areas where you're going to get some Aleutians, no huge change, at least that we can discern from the data is what it sounds like, still in good condition and from a population status level. So get out and enjoy that resource, and maybe you can outsmart them this year. And let's see, where do we want to go now? Perhaps let's just talk about the different subspecies of Canada geese. Remind me again, we obviously have Duskies, and what are the lessers? Are there any others that we encounter out there?
Western Canada geese, those are the ones that breed locally. And in general, those populations in most areas are doing fairly well. There's a lot of early season hunts, some of which are going on right now and people are taking advantage of that target those birds specifically. But yeah, those are our local geese.
Now, are those the same as what we refer to over here as the giants, or is that a different subspecies?
That's a different subspecies.
But are they of a larger size than...
They are. So their Duskies are fairly large, probably between 6 and 8 pounds. And then Westerns are probably at that 7 to 10 pound range on average.
But their population is doing good, continues to be making good use of that kind of. I mean, are they urban, suburban nesting birds? They are? Okay.
Yep, there's plenty of, I would say, golf courses and other urban locations are a hot spot.
Okay, that's the source of those birds. Well, what about Duskies? We've talked about that, unless there's another update on Duskies. Obviously, it's a closed season on Duskies. Any read on changes in their population size?
Slight bump in this year's population, a couple hundred birds. A lot of those surveys both incorporate Middleton Island as well as the Copper River Delta, and those are what's called fixed visibility surveys. So a lot of those are aerial. There are nest plot surveys that also happen, as well as a multitude of other studies that are going on that many partners are involved with. Making sure that Duskies are at least sustaining. And
from a population size standpoint, we're talking about a pretty, relatively speaking, pretty small population size. I'm looking at the numbers here, around 13,000. So it kind of puts that into perspective with respect to cackling geese and the Aleutians. Any idea on, let's see, lessers? I guess that would be the next one here, lesser Canada geese. Any idea on population size and status for that one?
Kind of like Taverners, they're hard to, they're not really a survey focus. They're hard to find. They're spread out. And so a lot of the numbers on them, from my understanding, are they basically have their surveys and they have, where they analyze the population, and those are dropping a little bit. But I don't think there's definitely some efforts being made to understand these birds a little better.
Anything else on the white-cheeked goose front before we move on? We have a few other species here that we want to talk about. We're probably not going to spend much time on Brant or emperors. Again, that's a fairly limited harvest opportunity for the location of those birds. But anything remaining on the white-cheeked geese before we move on here?
No, I will say I want to thank some of the folks in Alaska for kind of walking me through how some of these surveys are done and my understanding of them, and hopefully I am accurately portraying how this data is gathered.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody out there hears something that maybe we didn't get quite right, let us know. We'll follow up and try to provide a little correction or provide some additional information. If you have any of that kind of feedback, you can email us at dupodcast@ducks.org. Always great to hear from folks. And with that, we've already talked about snow geese a little bit, just in terms of where those populations originate from in terms of the Western Canadian Arctic and Wrangel Island in Russia. But let's talk about the status of those. Let's just start with the Wrangel Island population. What do you know about that? Does that population continue to increase?
Yes, that population definitely has increased, and populations continue to remain strong. We don't have a good handle, again, like on most of these, on what this year's breeding showed. However, there's a couple data gaps, and so this year we really are looking forward to seeing what this year's breeding estimate was. But based off of what came down the Flyway last year, it seemed that this population is definitely increasing.
I think your take-home point here is that Pacific Flyway snow geese, whether we're looking on Wrangel Island, whether we're looking at the Western Canadian Arctic, those populations continue to grow by all indications. At least that's what I think I'm hearing. So from a hunting perspective, that's a good deal from opportunity, but it also poses some challenges farther down the Flyway in the Central Valley and perhaps some other areas. Is that a fair characterization in terms of sort of overall upward trend and then the other things I mentioned?
Yes, absolutely. And it seems that in the last several years, a lot of the snow geese that are in Washington and Oregon definitely have a very high juvenile to adult ratio. So it's fair to assume that even though we may not have counts for some of those COVID years, that those populations are on the increase.
And then with reference to perhaps some of the concern around that growing snow goose population in the Pacific Flyway. This is where we can talk about drought again. And of course, Dr. Mark Petrie has talked with us about this before. I think he had an article in the DU magazine where he referenced some of this. That large population of snow geese, and I guess white fronts as well, that make it to the Central Valley of California, are competing for the same resources that ducks are competing for in that Central Valley of California. And this year, as we have heard, there's a crunch in terms of both water as well as rice production. Rice production was down somewhere in the neighborhood of 60%, and we also have heard about significant water restrictions. And so while snow geese and white fronts don't necessarily require water for some of that field feeding, there nevertheless is going to be a reduction in the amount of rice waste grain on the landscape because of that reduction in the amount of planted rice to begin with. So all those things combined, less rice, less water, is going to make for an interesting situation in the Central Valley this year in terms of seeing how many birds concentrate on the limited habitat that's out there and what those birds might do in response to that. You have any prognostications for us there, Kelly?
I don't. I'm actually super anxious to see what this fall is going to bring, though, because if all of a sudden there's only a fraction of the birds that are down wintering in that area than there was prior, okay, where do those birds go? Are they going to come back up into Southwest Oregon, Northwest Oregon? Are they going to go over onto the coast? Where are those birds going to have to find the resources that they need on the wintering grounds to go back up at breeding grounds and breed successfully? Or, where are these birds going to end up showing up?
This year it continues to be interesting as we find ourselves still navigating the wake of the interruption of the data streams as a result of travel restrictions, COVID-19, all that kind of stuff. We're not fully clear of all of that yet, some of which is because of the nature of the timing of the surveys that we're talking about here for geese. They're not covered in that annual, not all covered in the annual waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. There are some estimates and some graphs and some reports in the report covering these different populations. But as you read through that, you realize that as you said, Kelly, we're still not, we're not caught up, at least in terms of some of the pieces of that data stream. So it feels like we're still, I don't want to say completely in the dark, but we haven't yet fully emerged from the cloud that COVID brought, that COVID put us under. Would you agree with that?
I would totally agree with that, and specifically on those birds in the Pacific Flyway that are looked at very carefully because of their population status. But yeah, I totally agree. And
so that's why, as you said, as we go forward this year and then into next spring, going to be really interesting to see what those data points are for these different populations of geese. I guess, Kelly, let's move to a bit of a wrap up here. We haven't talked a whole lot about white fronts. I guess before we get to a wrap up, anything you'd like to say from a white front perspective, population status, population trend as it would affect Pacific Flyway hunters?
They're pretty consistent as far as what their numbers have been for a while. They're way over objectives for the Pacific Flyway population, and it'll just continue to be interesting to see what happens with white fronts as a lot of their wintering ground resources aren't in production anymore. So I think that's the only thing I'll add. Yeah, okay.
I think we mentioned objectives a couple of times, and so it's probably worth following up or at least clarifying that when we talk about those objectives for goose populations, we're talking about those generated through those flyway or through the goose management plans created by the Pacific Flyway Council in the tech section, right?
Correct. Absolutely. And honestly, I remember being in high school and wanting to find out more about how these birds were managed. I think all the flyways have basically resources where you can tap into those management plans for a given flyway and learn more about how they come up with the numbers that they do, including, the numbers that we're talking about today, the different surveys that are are a part of how those numbers are articulated. It is a very thorough process for making sure that, everything is balanced as far as making sure that these resources are here for the future.
Another way of saying that is that if you want to locate and download all these reports and then read them and dig into the tables, you can get drunk on data, I think is a safe way of saying that.
100%.
And I'm sure you've done that a time or two, right, Kelly?
Probably more often than I should.
Yeah. So from a high level, let's kind of recap. Like if somebody comes up to you in the office, say, "Hey, Kelly, how's the Pacific Flyway Goose outlook looking for this year? How's it shaping up?" What do you tell them? Sort of 1 or 2 minute encapsulation of all that we've talked about over the past hour.
That's a complicated question. Do you want the 1 minute version or the 45-minute version?
No, I think at this point we're going to go with the one. I'll give you 2 minutes. Let's do it in 2.
Exactly. So no, that's where you can get into the weeds. But in general, and even across all flyways, goose populations in general are doing really well, except for a few populations within the Pacific Flyway where we're having to decrease bag limits on cackling geese, and of course duskies are illegal to shoot in Oregon and Washington, and in the permit zone specifically. So you have to factor those things in, but in general, goose populations in the Pacific Flyway, with the exception of a few, are doing awesome. And
so if you are interested in getting out there and chasing the geese in the Pacific Flyway, sounds like it's going to be another great year for opportunity. Can never promise great harvest because that's mostly up to you. It's mostly up to a whole lot of other factors as well. But appreciate Kelly, you being here and you doing all the research to kind of help us understand what's going on there as best we can. As I mentioned, kind of still going through some limitations in that data stream, trying to catch up on that. Before we close out here, I did want to give you another opportunity to thank all the people that are involved in the collection of the data and that may have helped you pull together a lot of this information.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that opportunity, because I definitely owe a lot of this to their efforts and the work that they're doing on the ground, overseeing a lot of these surveys and other things. So Julian Fisher with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Tasha DiMarzio with Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Kyle Spraggins and Brandon Reiches, who are the state coordinators for Oregon and Washington. They really kind of helped guide me through doing my best to articulate what we discussed here today.
And a final reminder for anyone that is going to get out and try to hunt any of these goose populations in the Pacific Flyway or any flyway for that matter, make sure you check your local, state, federal regulations to ensure that you're in compliance with everything related to the hunting of these species. We certainly do not profess to be the ones that share all of those regulations, so that's still up to you. Make sure you get out there and check those regs and get out and enjoy the resource. It's another great year, and the time is upon us. And Kelly, thanks again for joining us here, and we hope to catch up with you sometime again in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. And head west. We can take you out anytime.
I'd love to do it, and I'll take you up on that. A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Kelly Warren, regional biologist with Ducks Unlimited out in Western Oregon. We appreciate all of his time and that he invested in getting us this great information on Pacific Flyway geese. We also thank our producer, Chris Isaac, who does a terrific job with these episodes and getting them out to you. And then to you, the listener, we thank you for your time. We thank you for your support and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation, and we encourage you to have a great hunting season this year.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks.